We're going to get started now. It's a very chilly evening here in Cambridge, but we are going to transport ourselves and explore the extraordinary mosaic heritage found along the Northern Adriatic coast. This event is kindly hosted in collaboration with Distant Horizons, and they've been working with us here at Cambridge since 1999, making them one of our longest standing tour operators. And this evening, I'm also delighted to introduce and welcome Nirvana Romell, who has been leading tours with us for many years. We're so pleased to have you, Nirvana. Thank you. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping notes from me. If you want to ask questions during this evening's talk, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. And when Nirvana is sharing her slides and showing her fantastic images, if you want to see them in full view, make sure you minimize the thumbnail view of the cameras of the panelists that are visible. That should help. But also, we are recording this, so you will be able to watch back and pause on the images and look closely after this evening's session. Okay, that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Daniel now from Distant Horizons. And Daniel, unfortunately, your video is not working, but we are so glad you are here.
Yeah, no, thanks, Daniel. Elsie. Yep. Thanks, Elsie, very much. Yeah, my name's Daniel Moore. I'm very sorry the video is not working. That may be a benefit for some, but anyway. My name's Daniel Moore. I help manage the travel company Distant Horizons. We organize scholar-accompanied journeys to all parts of Asia, North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. We try and focus on slightly lesser visited destinations within those regions. And we try and include special experiences or extra experiences that really allow the traveler to get under the skin of a country they're traveling in. These might be briefings from journalists, local experts, local academics. It might be brief visits to private collections, meals in private homes. And of course, as always, food and wine tastings are crucial to a lot of what we do. We've been working, as Elsie has said, with Cambridge University and Oxford University for over 25 years. I actually think our first trip was 1998, but Elsie said 1999. I could be corrected on that. But in that time, we've probably taken or organized nearly 300 trips for alumni, and probably taken over 2,500 alumni and friends and family of alumni who are more than welcome to travel on these trips. A couple of housekeeping points. I think Elsie sort of covered these, but definitely encourage questions. Please do ask them, but please do use your chat box, and I'll try and collate questions and put those to Nirvana at the end of the lecture. We've had a couple of questions or a few questions before, and I'll put those to just before we get to Nirvana, if I may just canter through some of the trips that Cambridge are planning for 2026. In late spring of next year, 2026, Dr. Alex Koller I think he's organizing his 4th or 5th trip to Romania. This trip is going to focus on the sort of former principalities in Romania of Moldavia, Transylvania, and Wallachia. And I think Dr. Alex Koller will show that a lot of Romanian history and culture is very much determined by outside influences, be they the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, the Habsburgs. And that's in late spring 2026. In September 2026, Lucia Ferraro company, probably her 3rd or maybe 4th trip to the Amalfi Coast. Clearly a walker's paradise. But it's not just wonderful coastline and beautiful walks there. There are sites of real historic and cultural interest, be it Pasatum, be it Herculaneum, and of course Pompeii. And there are 2 nights at the end of the trip in the high-octane city of Naples. And then in September of next year, Dr. Desmond Chung is accompanying a Cambridge party to China, and this will cover many of the major sites in China: Beijing, Xi'an, Hangzhou, Shanghai, and Guilin. But if there's few countries in the world that have changed more in the last 30 years, and I suspect few countries that will change more in the next 30 years. And so Dr. Chung will have very much a foot in the past, but probably a huge foot in the future too. And then in October of next year, There's a journey to Japan, accompanied by Dr. Simon Kainer. I think that's his second alumni journey to Japan, and that will cover many of the major sites of Japan, particularly Honshu Island, be it Tokyo, Hakone, Kanazawa, Hiroshima, Miyajima, and of course Kyoto. And then finally, there's a journey from Aquileia to Ravenna, and very much that's the subject of today's lecture, which Nirvana will give us much more information on. And just before I hand over to Nirvana, if any of those trips look of interest, there's the email for Distant Horizons, there's our website, and we'd be very happy to send you a full in-depth itinerary. They're normally 8 or 9 pages with information on hotels, sightseeing, meals, etc. But that's enough from me. If I can now hand over to Nirvana for today's lecture. Thank you very much. Nirvana, I think that's over to you now.
Yep. Yes. Hi, good evening. Well, thank you for tuning in. I hope I will be able to convey my boundless fascination with the mosaics I will be showing you tonight. I have fond childhood memories of them, and then I love discovering the academic part at the university, but it's really only in the last decade since I started designing and leading tours to the area for the Distant Horizons that actually the penny dropped, and I started thinking about them in a different way. Well, allow me to brag here. My tour to Aquileia in 2015, the locals told me, was the first organized visit by the British tour operator. And they joked that they haven't seen English-speaking people since the Second World War. I started to look at these sites laterally, not as individual monuments, but as an evolving historical conversation, a record of tremendous changes and political and religious disputes that had much wider effect in European history. Allow me to share the okay. Here we go. So there are 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the Northern Adriatic, which have earned that status with their exceptionally well-preserved architecture and mosaics in particular. Ravenna is the best known. Aquileia is starting to get busier. It used to be just tumbleweeds and mosaics, but these days the visitors are bussed from cruise ships docking in Trieste, so it's getting busier. Poreč in Croatia profits from the general mass tourism, but it's anyone's guess how many visitors are aware of the unique nature of the mosaics there. And then you have a Torcello that languishes these days in a back of beyond of the Venetian lagoon. So we'll take a whistle-stop tour through these places to piece together the story of the rises and falls of kingdom and empires as they were. And as they are not written, not sculpted, not painted, but actually told with millions of mosaic tesserae. I won't be going into a great deal of iconographical detail, as we'd need quite a few hours for that. And also the academia is never quite sure. They're always disputing the symbolism of this or that. And also, obviously, I can't show you everything. So this is sort of my the best of, my personal best of, my personal choice of these mosaics, but I will tell you of the social and political background and the connections between these sites. We'll start with Aquileia. They were the first, there was the first great center of that area and the oldest mosaics. The saying goes that all roads lead to Rome, but in reality, they all led to Aquileia, which was the city port connected via land or water to all the major trading routes in the empire. Because of its geopolitical importance, it also controlled all the Alpine passes in the area into today's Switzerland, Austria, and Slovenia, and was collecting duty on any goods that were traded. So imagine the wealth. These were the most profitable borders in Europe. And Aquileia was a very prosperous, multicultural, international place. So the Roman mosaics that we find there are mostly of the highest, finest quality. And here's an example. It's a part of a dining room floor which served as a room divider, because Romans often kept their home shrines in their dining room. So this strip of mosaic would have marked the threshold between the dining and praying area. We can only speculate about the meaning of this piece since the rest of the floor is missing, but now that you see this detail, central detailed bow, what we can tell with certainty that this bow is made using the most demanding and elaborate mosaic technique called opus vermiculatum, which means worm-like work. And you can see why, because it never uses tesserae larger than 3 to 4 millimeters on each side. Imagine the precision and the finesse of this. So notice here how the mosaicist outlines this bow in ochre and then uses darker and lighter colors to create an illusion of light and shadow, of three-dimensional form. It's like bulging and then it feels like it's moving. So opus vermiculatum was usually made in a workshop as a separate panel because it was so complex and difficult, and then set in floors of larger size tesserae. It is the most expensive mosaic form, an ultimate showpiece, both for the artist to show off the skills and for the patron's wealth. Even if we knew nothing of Aquileia and just stumbled upon this mosaic opening the first dig, we could conclude that we were in an important place where wealth and talent were present in abundance. Because I have a limited time to show you a lot of mosaics, I will just flick through the Roman period to illustrate that by the time we get to the early Christian period in the 4th century, which is really the superstars of Aquileian mosaics, Aquileia is full of mosaics, and their social function is, broadly speaking, to decorate, illustrate, and show off. So here, for example, we have a decorative central panel from a floor from a private house showing the fish life from the nearby Grado lagoon. In the great baths, which were one of the largest bath complexes of the entire Roman Empire at the time. We have obviously water-related deities, as expected. So we have a Triton and his sister-in-law, Clymene. The socio-political context of these mosaics and their messages, it's relatively all simple and straightforward. But when in 1313, all Roman citizens were granted full religious freedom, it gets more exciting because the Christians decided to put mosaics to more educational use. And I think they really exploited the full power potential of mosaic art. Aquileia already had a significant Christian community, which immediately erected the first church. The original structure would have looked like this. It was a large rectangular, approximately 70 meters wide and 40 meters long, which was a formidable size for the time. And as we understand it today, the south hall to your right would have served as a sort of a classroom where the neophytes were taught the basic Christian dogmas, and then they would graduate to baptism in the courtyard and confirmation in the vestibule, and then only then they would be allowed to attend the full mass in the North Hall. Now, this complex was extended and rebuilt 4 more times since then, so what you see today in this picture is an amalgamation of building materials and styles as well as human preservance. And it is very interesting architectural complex, but what makes it truly exceptional is the original mosaic from the 4th century, which you get to see as you walk through the main door of today's Basilica. We don't really know when it was covered up because there are no written records of it. But in 1909, during some restorations, the floor of this existing church was lifted and mosaics were discovered to everyone's astonishment. It took 3 years to reveal the floor of this the great neophyte classroom. And the excavations are still ongoing throughout the rest of the complex. Now, can you just imagine the thrill? Over 700 square meters, 7,500 square feet, have been cleared, making this the largest Paleo-Christian mosaic in the world, with motifs seemingly similar, but iconologically very different from the earlier Roman motifs. The mosaics are of varying quality and design, so we can conclude that several workshops must have worked together, and this would have been a commission of a century. Stylistically, they do draw inspiration from the Romans, but are quite basic, almost naive. And the assumption is that that was not due to the lack of skills or imagination, but to achieve the widest appeal possible amongst the multicultural populace of Aquileia. In this Sunday school hall, the mosaics are divided in 4 irregular zones, like chapters, each moving the visitor towards higher knowledge. Some zones are further divided into smaller rectangulars, and then the whole floor, as you can see, it appears as if it's a precious carpet. It's covering the entire floor of the basilica from walls to walls. In the first zone, we learn the basics. There are knots of Solomon, crosses, sort of abstract ornamentations. The knots of Solomon symbolize the unity between God and man and eternity. And as most of them are made with tessera in 3 colors with black outline, they might also be referencing the Holy Trinity. We're not sure. Again, the motifs are really from the old Roman catalogs, but their interpretation is departing from the usual Roman literal realism. The iconology, the symbolism is more complex. So we're using abstract ornaments, but they carry so much more meaning than before. Now, look at the tortoise and cockerel standoff. In late Roman interpretation, the cockerel is a protector. He's a vigilant animal that wards off evil spirits. The name for the tortoise, which in modern Italian is still called tartaruga, comes from the ancient Greek tartarukos, which means inhabitant of Tartarus, which was a hellish underworld where the souls of sinners were punished. Does that remind you of something? In late Latin, tartaruca also meant a demon. So we have the good old story of good versus evil, but here it's getting more Christian meaning, because the poor tortoise is also a symbol of sin and evil and of backwardness, of stubborn adherence to old pagan ways, because it is so slow, not just in movement, but in thinking. And the cockerel announces the new day, which is the light made by God, and it's also related to Saint Peter, the founder of the church. So as you enter this hall, the proposition is made to you that the new God can save your soul from the horrors of Tartarus. There are also, in that same region, donor portraits. Some of them have a very small inscription stating the mosaic surface that he or she had paid for. Now, there is an aspect of good old self-glorification, but they also show that wealthy people are Christian, because people had the choice of many gods and religions at the time, but they all thought that it was difficult to get wealthy without God on your side. So since these donors were so wealthy that they could sponsor mosaic floors, this sends a message that Jesus was the right God to choose, both to save your soul and to succeed in life. Now, having gone through this first section and hopefully grasped the concepts of unified God and man, eternity, Holy Trinity, as well, that is a good idea to donate to the church, the neophytes would have moved to the second span, where this wonderful Good Shepherd awaits, surrounded by a variety of fauna. Each of them would probably have its own symbolism. So pheasant stands for the beauty and immortality of the soul. Storks killing the snake might signify the removal of sin. But as I said, we don't have time, and we don't really know what is the exact interpretation for each animal anyway. The bigger message of this mosaic was that the good shepherd takes care of all kinds of animals, not just the chosen ones. And again, Aquileia was a very multicultural place, so this message of inclusivity is very important. One of the attractions of Christianity was that it appeared very welcoming and democratic towards anybody, everybody, in comparison to other religions. Now, past the portraits, the Good Shepherd, and the nibbling partridges, we move to the third zone, where the original altar once stood, but it is now in the middle of the 11th century basilica. It has a number of panels showing Christians bringing gifts. This youngster on the right is carrying a speared fish and a small basket of bread rolls, like the boy who brought bread and fish to Jesus, with which he fed many in the Gospel of St. John. This woman is releasing a bird. A bird is usually a symbol of soul, but also of peace between God and man. Then we have a lady carrying very large grapes, which are symbolic of the blood of Jesus and the wine that is offered as the part of the Eucharist. And then this man again is bringing a basket of bread, another symbol of the Eucharist. And all of them are greeted by an angel, or you can also see there's a Roman winged victory. I mean, it's a familiar face. And the angel is offering them a crown of laurel leaves and the palm branch. This would have been done in the ancient athletic contests, but here it references the 1 Corinthians, where Christians are mentioned as those who have run and received the prize. The prize is, of course, the Eucharist, which is again symbolized by the basket of bread rolls and the chalice here by her feet. Now, in the early Christian Eucharistic liturgy, people would form a procession to the altar bearing gifts of various food, which they would bring to share amongst each other and receive the Eucharist in return. So this whole section around the altar teaches how to participate in the Eucharistic liturgy. And then from there, the final section of the floor shows the story of Jonah without any divisions. Almost the entire area is the sea, full of exciting sea fauna, not too dissimilar from the ones seen in the earlier Roman mosaic. Now, to your right here, there is a medallion. Sorry, in the left picture, but to the right of it, so more or less in the center of a slide, you can see that there's a medallion with a dedication, which simply acknowledges Bishop Theodore completion of the basilica with divine assistance, of course. Now, again, overall, there's a visual continuity between the Roman and Paleo-Christian visual style, but iconography is very different. Except for this first boat, we'll get back to it, that's to your left. Angels are in charge of all other boats, and they are very engaged in trying to catch as many fish as possible. Some are standing on rocks, and they all have different tools. They have fish nets, fishing rods, line hooks. The fish represent souls in need of salvation, and the angels are hard at work here. And alongside the sacred hunt, the story of Jonah develops from left to right. Now, as you know, God commanded Jonah to go and preach in Mesopotamia, but Jonah didn't fancy the job and fled with a Phoenician ship. Now, God whipped up a storm to punish Jonah, and we see Jonah here standing with his arms raised, praying to God to save the ship and the crew. Now, immediately to his right, the next episode is already taking place. The Phoenicians figured out that the storm was Jonah's fault and promptly threw him into the sea, where he was swallowed up, the Bible tells us, by a whale. As no one had ever seen a whale in the Northern Adriatic, they used the image of Baptistries, a well-known mythological sea monster with a snake's tail. Now, after 3 days, Jonah was vomited out upon the dry land, surprise, which you can see here. And he realized that he really should obey God. And finally, we see him at peace with God and enjoying himself, having a siesta under the pergola of courgettes, which are quite common in the area. Now, imagine if you were a poor, illiterate person and came and saw all this, the fishes swimming here, there, and everywhere, the angels casting nets and hooks, the monster swallowing and spitting out the hero. I mean, it was like the wildest action movie. And then there's this wonderful message of hope, the resurrection, eternity, forgiveness, looking at the entire floor from the basic concept of Trinity and eternity, battle of good and evil, then the all-inclusive God shepherd, the feast of Eucharist, and finally Jonah's redemption and siesta. I mean, don't you think this is one of the best told lessons ever? So these are the mosaics in the South Hall. They are aiming to bring you into the fold, but the accepted theory is that the mosaics in the Northern Hall were meant for the eyes of the inculcated, those that are in the know, but again, no academic consensus has been reached about their overall meaning, because the excavation here is far more complicated, because the 11th century bell tower was built on top of the central part of this floor. And more recently, I think in the last sort of 15, 20 years, to add to the excitement, there's been some subsiding, as you can see, and then very fine older Roman mosaics have been found beneath the Christian ones. So the excavations are going very slowly. It was believed that the mosaics in the Northern Hall simply represented a Garden of Eden, but recent theories coming from Italian researchers suggest that the images symbolize certain Gnostic beliefs and possibly other Middle Eastern ideas, not quite certain. But Gnostic Christianity, which emphasizes personal spirituality over the institutional dogmatic one, was very popular in Aquileia, and sort of formed this quite independent spirit that I'll talk about it later on. And it was very popular this time when these mosaics were created. So whether the lobster was a horoscope symbol or a great meal in paradise, it's anyone's guess still. The peacocks eating from the tree of life could have a strong Gnostic interpretation or not. And equally, the baskets of snails and mushrooms, they might be a meal or they might have some very lofty meanings. But we better leave this to the academics to argue about. Now, Aquileia became an important religious center from where the Christianization of northern Italy and today's Slovenia and Istria were conducted. But we have to leave it now to its destiny and move on to Ravenna. Aquileia was sacked by Attila the Hun in 452 and never really recovered after that sack. The Goths had little to do there. And then it was conquered by the Lombards in 568. And sometimes during this period as well, earthquakes rerouted the river Natiso, which is what provided a big port and a connection to the Adriatic for Aquileia. And there was some silting, so it lost the port. It was in the middle of a large field, difficult to protect. So the city really sort of went to tumbleweeds. I mean, today the population is about 3,000 and a half, something. But the institution of the Patriarchy of Aquileia remained powerful, sometimes as much as the Pope or the Patriarch of Constantinople, and was the shining beacon of religious tolerance throughout the dogmatic disputes that I will be mentioning and schisms that shook the Christianity between the 5th and the 8th centuries, between non-Chalcedonian and Chalcedonian Christians. But to illustrate these squabbles, it is best that we move on and look at the mosaics in Ravenna. Now, Ravenna, just to give a bit of a map and bearing, was also an important Roman port, but about half the size of Aquileia. It became the capital of the Western Roman Empire in 402, simply because it was in the middle of a muddy field again, and Romans thought that it would be easier to defend it against the Goths. Because of all these swamps and marshlands, it's effectively right next to the delta of the River Po. But the Goths passed it and then conquered Rome in 410 and then turned back and took Ravenna in 470 and made it the capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom. A treaty was agreed between the Ostrogoth king Theodoric and the Byzantine emperor Zeno that installed Theodoric as the ruler of the West in the emperor's name. So I know the Ostrogoths get really bad reputation and so on, but they were in many ways behaving in the same way that the Romans behaved after they conquered Greece. They really had a great appreciation for all things Roman and wanted a certain continuation. Now, the thing was that the Ostrogoths were Arians, and the Theodoric actually did not interfere with the Orthodox Chalcedonian Christians who lived in Ravenna. Instead, he commissioned separate places of worship for himself and his fellow Arians, so he started to build. Now, Arians did not follow the rules of Chalcedon and were officially excommunicated by the Council of Nicaea in 325. Yet, as you can see by this map, the majority of the Western and Northern European Christians remained faithful to the beliefs that were brought to them by the Bishop Arius from Alexandria in the late 3rd century. Essentially, the key point of contention was the fact that they did not believe in Holy Trinity. They believed that Jesus, as the Son of God, was created by God the Father, but that was for them the clear reasoning that therefore it was a distinct from God the Father. And they did not believe that Christ was divine throughout. They thought that he only became divine upon his resurrection. So effectively, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit being of one substance, holds no water, wholly of otherwise for Arians. This battle of doctrines is best shown in these mosaics. Now, on your left is the mosaic in the dome of the Arian baptistry, and on the right is just a decade or so older standard Christian baptistry. So Orthodox, I write Orthodox because it just means as adhering to the prescribed dogma. So as Chalcedon was a prescribed dogma at the time, that would be considered the orthodoxy. Now, architecturally, I'm not showing here the buildings, but just trust me on this, they are very, very similar. But stylistically, when you come inside and you look at all of the mosaics, and there's plenty, so I'm just trying to focus on key details. The Neonian one, which is it's called Neonian or the Orthodox after the Bishop Neon that started it. So it sits firmly with the traditional Roman classical style. Just look at the Saint John the Baptist here, and he looks very much in a sort of Roman realism, and the land here as well. You have obviously the allegory of the River Jordan, and you have it here, but here it's quite sort of the Arian baptistry is got this gold background, and it looks quite sort of static and flat in comparison. However, it's actually following the latest fashion coming from Constantinople. But in any way, both sides, you think you have very similar thing. I mean, there's St. John the Baptist, there's the allegory of River Jordan, there's Jesus standing in it, and it's being baptized. But actually, the knowing eye can see the differences. So, as Arians did not believe in the divine nature of Christ prior to his resurrection, nor in the Holy Trinity as one substance, they really stressed in art, whenever in visual representation, Jesus as a human. And they often portrayed him as this beardless adolescent rather than a fully grown-up man with a beard and muscle definition. So on the left, you have this podgy adolescent, and on the right, you clearly have a young male Jesus. The Orthodox Christ is baptized, and the Holy Spirit is just hovering about it. But on the left, you see that the Holy Spirit is showering young Jesus with the original water of Genesis, therefore imbuing him with the Spirit that he, as a mere mortal at that point, is still lacking. And the Orthodox Christ is facing west, because it was believed that he was crucified facing west, and that true followers of God must first renounce evil and darkness by turning west. So here he's renouncing the evil and darkness, and then turn towards the light in the east. Now, Arians did not believe in any of that, so they simply had Jesus facing east towards Bethlehem and Jerusalem. So these two mosaics are presenting us with different versions of Christianity, and in an interesting twist, we find the old Roman realism. So think about it, old Roman realism effectively would have been considered pagan, but we find it inside the dogmatically correct Orthodox baptistry. And then we have the new Byzantine symbolism and style inside the supposedly heretical Arian baptistry. It's quite sort of a mind boggle, these two. Similarly to Aquilean mosaics, the destiny of Arian baptistry was saved because they were at some point whitewashed, and that saved them. So they were only discovered during the Allied bombing in Ravenna in the Second World War, because there were other Arian monuments and mosaics across Ravenna built during the short period that the Ostrogoths were there. But the Byzantines, when they conquered it, went about obliterating any sign of Arianism, and sometimes to a slightly comical effect. So if we go to San Apollinare Nuovo, we can see here this battle, because when we look at the baptistries, there was no actually battling, because the Ostrogoths were tolerant of other views. But when the Byzantines come back into the power, the only thing that they want to impose is their own ways. So here we have this battle. Now, this church was built as a Palatine Arian Christian church, so it would have been a royal chapel, and it was dedicated to Christ Redeemer. And then the Byzantines took over, and they covered up whatever they could that had Arian symbolism. Now, mosaics were expensive, so they didn't go about destroying things. Whatever didn't scream of Arianism, they left. But whatever was indicating Arian beliefs, they were covered with their own mosaics, and they reconsecrated the church, dedicating it to the Saint Martin of Tours, who was known for his intolerance towards non-Chalcedonians. Now, with the apse has been lost over the centuries, but we still have these original mosaics on the south and north wall. And on the north wall, we have a procession of female virgin saints from the port of Classe, which was the port of Ravenna, to the enthroned Mary, led by the Magi. And and then on the south wall, we have a procession of male martyrs from the royal palace of Ravenna towards the enthroned Jesus, led by Saint Martin of Tours. So you know that Saint Martin would have been added, and also you know that Mary would have been added, because the Arians did not believe in any function of Mary except as a human vessel to give birth to Christ. So they did not venerate her at all. Now, I mentioned that the mosaics were expensive and so on, so they've only added when they had to, and definitely they remodeled the image of Jesus. So here you see this Byzantine Jesus with a golden background, and he's a wise, mature man rather than an Arian teenager. But it's quite funny. It gets funny here with the royal palace, because at the royal palace, we don't really know what was there, perhaps royal family or courtiers or whatever, but they would have been occupying these spaces between the columns. And now it's all covered with dark or gold tesserae, and then curtains that are tied in knots. But not all of the areas were fully covered. So if we really closely inspect this, we see that there are 3 hands sticking out from under the enforced camouflage. We assume it's a royal family, but of course nobody's going to go digging up through the mosaics to discover it here. So this battle can sometimes be quite funny, but sometimes it gets really, really serious, and probably the most serious that it gets and most politically interesting is in the mosaics that are in San Vitale, another glorious church that was started under the Ostrogoths but completed under the Byzantines. Again, I mean, San Vitale is covered in mosaics. We could spend hours talking about them, but I shall focus on the 2 most important ones that are in the apse. Above them is the young Christ, Pantocrator, ruler without a beard, and then we will talk about these 2. The first one, probably the most famous one, they are there to kind of indicate the pecking order, because by this point we have Justinian on the throne, and we have a great, it's kind of a schism really between the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian Christianity. There's causing a lot of grief overall to the empire. It is questioning the power of the Pope, the power of the church, of the councils, and also of the emperor. So at some point, the emperor even issues an edict condemning the 3 chapters, three written works that were in support of, let's say, the tolerance. It's a very complicated thing, so I'm not going to go into details. So now we have not just the church and the church fathers discussing this. We have the emperor also imposing his will on that. And in order to prove himself as somebody who should be doing this, who could be doing this, he is sending us the message via these great mosaics. We see emperor here in the middle, surrounded by 12 men like Jesus and 12 apostles, and there are 6 soldiers to our left who carry shields with the Greek letters chi, rho, the first 2 letters in the word Christ, and so the symbol of Christ here. Next to them, judging by their robes, are 2 civil servants, and then comes Justinian in imperial red shoes. Only the emperor was allowed to wear red shoes, and with a halo, and carrying the Eucharist bowl. The halo is not for him as a person, but as the symbol of his power as being given to him by God. So it's not the same halo as a saint something, but indicating that he's anointed by God here. Next to him is Bishop Maximanus, carrying a cross, and his name is written above him. He got the whole church finished, consecrated. And there are 2 priests there to the right. They are carrying a book of Gospels and a censer. And then there's a gentleman in the second row. He's probably the banker, Julianus Argentarius, who sponsored the building of the church. Altogether, they represent that procession for Eucharistic liturgy I mentioned when we were also looking at the 3rd zone of Aquilean mosaic. But if you remember there, those were just any man and any woman bringing bread rolls and wine, you know, and here there's no winged victory that is dispensing the bread and wine to the faithful. The emperor himself holds the bread basket, the body of Christ, and in the other pendant mosaic, his empress holds the chalice with the blood of Christ. So the mosaic here is meant to assert the fact that the earthly rule comprising the church and the emperor also has God-given dual nature, almost like Christ. Each attends to their own domain, and each assists the other in fulfilling God's purpose. but, we can chat here, like, what are the boundaries in their respective domains? Whose domain is bigger or more important? If one is bigger or more important, does that mean that its boss should be more powerful? This is touchy questions here. So by putting, this is, amongst the first time that we also see it in Hagia Sophia and so on, where the Byzantine emperors are asserting themselves inside the churches and trying to push this idea that the imperial power equals the God's power on earth. So to the right, as I mentioned, of the altar is the Empress Theodora, and she's carrying the goblet of wine to join that bread carried by her husband. And she has 2 civil servants and 7 ladies in waiting, potentially 5 ladies and 2 eunuchs, but they form her procession in a very lavish courtly setting. So it doesn't kind of appear as if it's church, but if it's a court. Theodora was of lowly origin and a prostitute in her youth, but Justinian was so in love with her that he got his uncle, who was then an emperor, to repeal the law that prohibited intermarriage between high and low classes. So it's truly a fantastic rags to riches story of female empowerment here. And she ruled alongside her husband and had so much political influence, which was unheard in Byzantium before and after her. So the history may have judged her partially at the time, but then she's subsequently been proven as a wise and capable empress, and she's still celebrated as a saint in the Orthodox Church. But in her time, she was mocked because of her past and accused of heresy because she actually adhered to the Oriental Church, which was non-Chalcedonian in effect. So perhaps the reason why her mosaic panel is a clear pendant to her husband's is not just to show his devotion to her, but also to quash the gossip about the heresy and present her also as a true Christian. She does not have a posse of 12 followers and is not stepping side by side with the church seniors like Justinian, but she does have the halo of the gods-given imperial power here. Interestingly, neither Justinian nor Theodora ever set foot in Ravenna, and she died at the age of 48, a few months after these mosaics were installed. But they are still there, and they are still advertised their divine rights. Now, not everybody was happy to fall in line with this idea of Ravenna. So, as I mentioned before, Aquileia was feeling always quite independent and quite sure of its own beliefs. And by this point, it was already conquered by Lombards, and Lombards were also of Germanic origin, also Aryan. So they were not particularly keen on this push by the emperor that was saying that he's got the right to declare what is appropriate, what is not appropriate in dogmatic sense, and was disagreeing with the Pope and the establishment about the banning any non-Chalcedonian notion from the official church. And there is a rebellion brewing everywhere. So there's this great schism that's led by the Patriarch of Aquileia, who is followed by the northern Italian bishops. But in terms of mosaics, we find it there across the sea in Croatia, in a city of Poreč. They were officially Byzantine, but we can look at the mosaic and rethink that notion. So the Basilica was built around the same time as all of these building and decorative projects were going on in Ravenna. We know that the whole project took approximately a decade. It is nicknamed after the Bishop Euphrasian, who commissioned it, but it is actually a cathedral dedicated to Assumption of Mary, similarly to Aquileian Basilica. And it is actually the first church in the Western Christendom to have 3 apses instead of just one. So that symbolizes the Holy Trinity, which was the concept hotly contested by the Arians. So in that aspect, we see the Poreč church following with the propositions, you know, of Chalcedon and of Pope and so on. However, it's the wall decoration, it's these mosaics that are quite interesting and perhaps a little bit different. I will focus only on the semidome of the apse on the top there. Forget about this beautiful ciborium. It's from the medieval time. So we'll look at this top and what is happening there. Right on top, we have Jesus, very similar to the Jesus in Ravenna. Could be made by the same workshop. And as you can see, he also looks very much like the Arian young pubescent kind of Jesus. He's got his 12 apostles. So nothing new is happening there. What is interesting from the social history point of view, it's the positioning of the key players here in this mosaic.
Oh, hi, Nirvana.
Yep.
We got a couple of questions coming in. Just slightly conscious of time as well.
I'm close. I'm Poreč.
Okay, that's fine. Absolutely brilliant.
Okay, so what is interesting here is that it's possibly for the first time ever in the history of Western European art that Jesus is not at the central point in the apse, but it is Mary. I mean, there's no doubt that he is victorious up there on top, but, you know, people don't tend to crook their necks looking all the way up there. They usually focus their gaze on the apsidal dome, and this is where Mary and child are enthroned. So there is Jesus, there's a very young Jesus, and then there's Mary sitting there on that throne. She's got the crown coming out, and the crown is made both of gold and the laurels, so it's a divine and earthly crown. And we can compare her with the other Madonna there from San Apollinare that I was showing earlier. There are just very slight differences here. So you have on one side the Ravenna one, where she is holding Jesus sitting on a throne and giving us the sign of blessing. And in Poreč, we have Madonna sitting and sort of putting a hand on his shoulder, but almost kind of presenting him to us. There are no symbols of imperial power in the Euphrasian Basilica. There's no privilegia depictions of emperors or civil servants in unity with the church and God. Mary here is the powerful one, and the only people near that power are saints and priests. Now, there is a letter discovered recently. It was written by the Pope, addressed to the exarchs of Ravenna, that says that calls, the Pope actually insists that the Bishop Euphrasius has to be removed from his seat, describing him as an evilmonger, biggest Aquilean impostor, and schismatic. And Pope asks to use the exarch to the Byzantines to use any means required to remove him. So it's very subtle here, but on one side we have Mary, who's very much a symbol of a church, holding onto the Christ sitting on the throne, and on the other side we have church and the Christ being turned towards every. So it is perhaps that the Poreč mosaic can be read as a opposition to the imperial power, to the thrones, to the official dogma, to the institution holding on to Christ for themselves and for their own purposes, and sort of proposing something different, which is religious autonomy and tolerance. And well, as Daniel pointed, time flies, great powers come and go, Romans, Byzantines, Lombards, whatever. And I'm finishing here with Venice, but not Venice, not San Marco. I just wanted to kind of introduce it here because, of course, all of these powers by this time have gone or demised, and the Venice is rising in the Northern Adriatic. Now, most people have been to San Marco, but for me personally, nothing sums up this elevation of Venice better than a little detail in the mosaic in the Last Judgment in the first cathedral of the Venetian lagoon, which is Santa Maria Assunta on the island of Torcello. Torcello is the parent island of the Venetian Republic and the first bishopric seat and the key settlement of the lagoon in the first millennium. And at the time that this mosaic was created, Venice was already starting to take over, but Torcello remained important and prosperous throughout Middle Ages. So when the church was being restored after the 12th century earthquake, the same mosaicists that were working at the same time at San Marco were working here as well. Here, this Last Judgment, you can see the 6 vertical registers. They are packed, obviously. You have on top crucifixion, then resurrection, Christ in glory with Mary, John, and the apostles and saints, and then weighing of the souls around here. And then down in the bottom, you have the scenes from the heaven and hell. Hell, as often is the case, is probably the most exciting part to look at. We have the naked, sexless gluttons devouring themselves. We have the avaricious burning in the fires of their greed. At the bottom, the envious are reduced to skulls with snakes slithering out of their eye sockets. But in terms of the political message, it is the top scene that speaks the loudest. We have an interesting portrayal of devil, stern and serious, but not as demonic as he appears later on in art. There's no horns, no tail, whatever. He's holding his child, the Antichrist. So perhaps, I'm just guessing here, there's a whiff of Cathar beliefs that were very powerful at the time in the basin. To the right, you have avenging angels, and they're pushing the sinners into the eternal fire. Now, the sinners are kings and queens and priests and Christians and non-Christians. So the general message might be as usual as across Europe in these Last Judgments, that neither wealth nor position would ensure one's safety from divine judgment. But the details of the headgear here are quite specific, and although there is no universal agreement on this interpretation, I'd like to look at these lost souls as the enemies of Venice, who were all struggling at the time to maintain or regain their own relevance. So you have Byzantines here, you have the Patriarch of Constantinople possibly here, you have the Patriarch of Aquileia maybe, who was the biggest local rival, the Holy Roman Emperors. You have the Moors of Spain, who were at disarray at the time, and maybe for a good measure, the Mongols that were marauding quite close by at the time. So the simple Christian message can also be turned into, well, how to put it politely, a middle finger to all your opponents, and brilliantly conveyed in a mosaic technique again. So to finish, from Classroom of Aquileia, and let's call it the mosaic washing instead of whitewashing of Ravenna, to the revolutionary Madonna in Poreč and vengeful Venetians, I hope I have managed to convey some of the exciting history of the Northern Adriatic as told not in scrolls, vellums, and parchments, but in millions of tesserae. Thank you.
Nirvana, thank you very much. That was great. We have a couple of questions, if I may.
Yeah.
I think everyone can hear me. One question is, does this archaeological evidence tell us anything about the collapse of the Roman Empire in the region?
Okay, so Gibbons wrote the Fall of Roman Empire in the late 18th century, and I think it's really time that we stop talking about the collapse of the Roman Empire. It didn't really collapse, it just rolled over. I mean, when the Edwardians took over from Victorians, nobody talked about the collapse of the British Empire. So in one way, no, because it didn't collapse, but it does talk, as you can see, about the changes that were the way that the empire was being transformed. It went through the phases of, you know, Goths, Lombards, Charlemagne trying to revive it, and so on. So it does speak of, on one side, the rise of the new religion in Christianity, but also it speaks of volumes of how these so-called barbarians tried to maintain the traditions of mosaic, the traditions of decorations, of church building, temple buildings, and so on. So yes and no, in a way.
Okay, thank you. It's kind of related, but another question is, can this influence that you've described today, which is very sort of geographical, also be seen further down the coast in Umbria and lower Italy, or is this very specific to where you're describing?
But well, again, yes and no, because of course you have great mosaics on Sicily, you have great mosaics in Rome, but in every place they fit their own socio-political context. So again, I would say no, in a sense that these really speak of the changes in that area. So Paleo-Christians, early Christians, they loved to decorate with mosaics because, of course, the sculpture was discouraged and banned at some point because it was worshipping of idols and so on. So there was great appreciation for mosaics, and in the places where there was a great tradition, usually also in the places where there's a great supply of material, and like here up in Aquileia and so on, if you go with me, you will understand why they make all these mosaics, because they have a lot of rubble there. And then they have a lot of wealth as well to bring in the more expensive materials. So in those places you'll find mosaics, but they will be relating to the socio-political context that you find in that place. So these early Christian mosaics of Aquileia are miles different from the early Christian mosaics in Rome, because they were speaking to different audiences. They had a different intention, they had a different message that they needed to convey. Similarly, later on if we compare Venetian, for example, mosaics or with the Sicily, again, it's somewhat different. Maybe San Marco can be compared with Sicily because in both aspects the state wants to celebrate itself and glorify itself. So depends on the place. It is very geographically defined.
Okay, and we have another practical question. Can you tell us something, please, about the evolution of the technique, e.g. choice of material, size of tesserae, style, through the sites you've described, the 4 sites you've described?
Well, you have a transition. So in Aquileia, we still have a traditional Roman technique, which means it's floors only, not on the walls. And then it's the Byzantines that start using it as a wall decoration. And the key difference is that when you look at the Roman mosaic, because it's on the floor, it's as smooth as possible, as flat as possible. When you look at the Byzantine mosaic, the tesserae inserted at the angle specifically so that all those gold tesserae can catch the light and make the whole wall surface shimmery. So those are 2 very big distinction. But in the terms, and obviously you have a slightly less background work when you are doing the walls, as opposed to when you're doing floors on which you are going to be walking on. But otherwise, tools and techniques remain unchanged for centuries, absolutely for centuries. So when I take the tour, we go to Spilimbergo School of Mosaic, where you can actually see them being done, and you understand when you look at it, they're done in the same way today as they were done, by the masters of Aquileia or Venice or whatever. Very, very little has changed in a technique. The only change was in the late 19th, early 20th century, invented in the school of Aquileia, when they have a sort of reverse way. So the finest mosaic is done in reverse and then turned over and inserted. But nothing else. It's almost a biblical technique, which is also why I'm so fascinated by it.
Nirvana, thank you very much. I'm slightly conscious of time, and having been visited Spilimbergo, I know exactly what you describe. It's a wonderful place to go, both in terms of what it is now and probably what it reflects in the past. But that's